Hi, this is Brian Kim. I'm going to share with you a modified double chop technique for learning surgeons. And again, this is just a starting point on your journey. I started to do this modified technique just to see if this would be a little bit easier, less scary for those who are trying this technique. Again, double chop is when I place the chopper around the contralateral lens and the peripheral lens, hooking the peripheral lens, placing the phaco tip vertically subincisionally, stabbing the lens in the subincisional area, and essentially applying opposing forces to crush the lens completely in half. And so that's the concept. The problem with double chop is, of course, one, people are scared to place the chopper out to the equator, which again, you have to overcome that if you're going to do any of these techniques. So that's just starting point number one. And then stabbing the subincisional lens with the phaco tip, which I don't think is really difficult. You just have to turn the phaco tip vertically and stabbing the lens. And then you have to be able to feel that tactile sensation of holding the lens with opposing forces and then applying that fracturing force. But you're going to see here, instead of placing the chopper out to the equator and holding it vertically, I'm going to rotate the chopper sideways. And so you can see I'm going to place the chopper around the lens peripherally. Again, you need to make sure you're underneath the rhexis edge, hooking the peripheral lens with the chopper, and that's perfect position right there. Again, the chopper is actually vertically oriented right now. And then simultaneously, I'm going to place the phaco tip vertically subincisionally. In this case, the lens is fairly soft, and I'm impaling and embedding the phaco tip into the lens material. Again, now there's opposing forces on both sides. Again, this is happening simultaneously, but I'm trying to break it down step by step here. And this is the maneuver. I'm turning the chopper vertically. You can see the shaft is more vertical and tilted, and the chopper is now sideways. Now, in order to do this safely, you have to make sure the elbow of the chopper at the leading edge is not too deep, because you don't want that chopper too deep into the capsular bag, and then you're going to poke the posterior capsule. And so again, you're just kind of rotating the chopper, and it's sideways now. I'm able to execute the fracturing with the double chop technique, and then now this is the cross chop technique. So again, what you're doing is you're placing the chopper around the equator, you're hooking the chopper subincisionally, the phaco tip, and then once you have opposing forces, you're going to rotate. Again, you're not going down into the lens with the chopper, you're just rotating it. And so by rotating the tip, you're not having it oriented vertically, which is scary for some people, and now it's oriented horizontally, and you can actually see a side profile of the chopper, and then you're able to apply the chopping force, the double chop technique, and then you're able to fracture the lens completely in half. And so that was the first case example. Let's go ahead and see a second case here. Again, removing the epinuclear material, placing the chopper under the rhexis edge, sliding and leading with the tip, getting the chopper under the rhexis edge out to the periphery, rotating the chopper vertically now, and then holding that position, and then rotating the phaco tip vertically subincisionally. Again, this is a fairly soft lens. I'm stabbing the lens material with the phaco tip. Again, I'm inside the rhexis opening this entire time. The rhexis is not violated. The rhexis is not manipulated. Again, I'm placing the chopper under the rhexis edge and placing the phaco tip vertically. And now once I have the opposing forces, I bring the instruments together. But if you notice here, I'm having the chopper slightly sideways. Again, the chopper is not pointed vertically. It's pointed a little bit towards me, more of a sideways profile, and by doing it that way, it might give the beginning surgeon a little bit more comfort that that phaco tip is not too deep. But more importantly, the elbow is still at the surface. You see that? The elbow is still at the surface, and that is your landmark to know that you're not going too deep with the chopper. Again, you can't place the chopper too deep. You don't want to rip the posterior capsule if you go too deep. Remember, the chopper is only 2.5 millimeters long. Again, the lens is 4 to 5 millimeters thick, and so you can't really violate it unless you go too deep with the chopper. This is another case, but this is a much denser lens. So again, I place the chopper out to the equator. The phaco tip is vertically subincisionally, but you see how vertically oriented the shaft of the chopper is. I've essentially kind of pronated my hand, and I'm oriented the chopper more vertically. The chopper is, again, more in a sideways orientation, but because the elbow is still somewhat on the surface of the lens, I know that I'm not too deep, and then I'm able to fracture the lens very confidently. Again, this is maybe easier and less intimidating for the learning surgeon. So again, fracture is complete. The lens has been bisected into 2 heminuclei. and then the cross chop is performed. And this is the next case. Again, removing the surface epinuclear material, placing the chopper under the rexus edge contra-incisionally, the phaco tip vertically sub-incisionally. Look how I lift that chopper shaft up vertically and also pronating slightly so that the chopper is oriented more in a horizontal position rather than a vertical position. You can see the tip of the chopper. It's contacting the phaco tip. Again, the elbow of the chopper is still on the surface of the lens. That way you know you're not too deep with the chopper. And again, this is a fairly dense lens. Again, be able to show how easy this is to execute and hopefully less difficult for the learning surgeon. Again, removing the surface epinuclear material, placing chopper under the rexus edge contra-incisionally, the phaco tip vertically sub-incisionally. Again, you can see that vertical positioning of the chopper, the sideways horizontal orientation of the chopper. Again, fairly dense lens, but excellent execution of the chop technique, the double chop technique, fracturing the lens completely in half. So you can perform these cases in denser lenses, but it's really easier to execute in the softer lenses. So again, for those who are learning how to do this technique, I would start with softer lenses. Don't try to do this technique on a brunescent lens. You're going to have much more difficulty, especially with this technique. It's really limited in that way. And so this is a small pupil case, but it's the same technique. You place the chopper under the rexus edge contra-incisionally, the phaco tip vertically sub-incisionally. You can see the sideways orientation of the chopper. It's in a more horizontal orientation, not vertical orientation. But again, the elbow of the chopper is still at the surface of the lens, and you're able to execute the chop technique, again, because this lens is relatively soft. In this last case, I'm going to share with you how the chop actually doesn't quite work the way you wanted it. So place the chopper under the rexus edge contra-incisionally, the phaco tip vertically sub-incisionally. Perform this modified double chop technique, turning the chopper more vertical. I go ahead and perform the cross chop technique, placing the chopper around the right heminucleus. It didn't quite get around it. So I go ahead and go around and perform the double chop one more time. Again, using that modified technique. I feel like I got good separation, but it feels a little bit strange. And then I go ahead and execute the cross chop technique, chopping the right heminucleus completely in half, lifting that first quadrant up. Everything seems to be going fine. And what you're noticing here now is the chop was not symmetrical. You can see this weird platform. It's like a shelf. And that's because with that modified chop technique, since it didn't go through that dense lens through and through, it caused a sideways chop. So it wasn't a very distinct fracture point that was vertical, bisecting the lens evenly. It had this weird shelf. And again, that is a symptom of the fact that that chopper was not deep enough and didn't give you enough leverage to get opposing forces to directly fracture the lens completely in half. As a result, it kind of fractured it sideways and created a large heminucleus on one side and a small heminucleus on the other side. Again, why? Because it didn't bisect through the densest central part of the lens. And so again, if you're going to do this modified chop technique and you're going to turn that chopper more sideways, that is one limitation, as you can see in this particular case. But again, otherwise, if it's not a super dense lens, if you execute the technique on softer lenses, making sure the elbow of the chopper doesn't go too deep into the lens bag area, you're not going to be in danger of ripping the posterior capsule or anything like that. You want to make sure that the elbow is fairly on the surface of the lens, and you're just going to rotate that chopper so that you could have the elbow slightly down, but not too much, but you're going to rotate it so that you're still within that same vertical plane, if that makes any sense. Again, placing the chopper around the lens material, and then having the phaco tip vertically oriented sub-incisionally, and then rotating that chopper so that you're pronating your hand a little bit, turning that chopper sideways. But since you're rotating within that space, you're not going down into the bag. You're not going vertically down towards the bag, the posterior capsule, and then therefore you're not going to really be at risk for rupturing the posterior capsule. So as long as you adhere to those principles, it might make it less scary, less intimidating for those who are learning and beginning to do double chop. this modified double chop technique, which I've started to do and experiment with, again, for your sake, to see if there's anything easier, perhaps less intimidating to perform this double chop technique. And once you do this, you can graduate to holding the chopper more vertically and then applying this technique to much more dense lenses, because you can't get by with that technique, this modified technique, with the really dense lenses. You need to be able to hook the peripheral lens vertically, pushing that chopper more vertical, which gives you deeper holding power of the lens. You have that phaco tip oriented vertically sub-incisionally, and then you can get an excellent fracturing leverage to mechanically fracture the lens with opposing forces with the standard double chop technique. But at least you can get yourself started and do this modified double chop technique, putting on some training wheels, so to speak, on your way to transitioning to the standard double chop technique. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I thank you for your attention.